Chapter 7. A little after Bartholomew Mass, Kristin set out on her homeward journey, with her great company of children and serving folk and all their baggage. Lavrans rode with her to Jødkin. They walked up and down the courtyard in talk, he and his daughter, the morning he was to set forth down the dale again. The hill country round them lay in sparkling sunshine. The mosses were red already, and the knolls yellow as gold with the birch copses. Out on the upland wastes, tarns glittered and grew dark again, as the shadows of the great shining fair-weather clouds floated across them. They kept rolling up unceasingly and sank down over the distant clefts and glens, amidst all the grey stone peaks and blue mountains with coombs of new snow and old snowfields that lay around as far as the eye could reach. The little grey-green patches of corn belonging to the rest house stood out strangely against the autumn hues of this shining mountain world. The wind blew fresh and sharp. Lavrans drew up the hood of Kristin's cloak, which had blown back upon her shoulders, and smoothed with his fingers the strip of linen coif that showed beneath it. "Methinks you have grown pale and thin-cheeked in my house," he said. "Have we not taken good care of you at home, Kristin?" "That you have. 'Tis not that." "Truly, too, this is a toilsome journey for you, with all these children," said her father. "Yes, though 'tis not because of these 5 that my cheeks are so pale." A smile flitted over her face, and when her father looked at her questioningly in alarm, she nodded and smiled a little again. The father looked away from her, but in a little while he asked, "Since this is so, then perhaps will not be so soon that you can come home to us in the dale again." "At least I hope it will not be 8 years," she said in the same tone. Then she caught a glimpse of the man's face. "Father! Oh, father!" "Hush, hush, my daughter." Unwittingly he caught her by the upper arm and stopped her, as she would have flung herself upon him. "No, Kristin." He took her hand firmly in his and began walking again beside her. They had come away from the houses. They were following now a little path in among the yellow birch thickets. They marked not where they were going. Lavrans jumped over a little rill that crossed the path, turned towards his daughter and gave her his hand over. She saw even in this little movement he was no longer springy and nimble as of old. She had seen it before without marking it. He no longer leapt into the saddle as lightly as he had done. He couldn't run up stairways any more, and he was not able to lift heavy things as easily as he was wont to do. He bore his body more stiffly and carefully, as if he had a slumbering pain within him, and went softly so as not to wake it. The blood could be seen beating in his neck veins when he came in from riding. Sometimes she had seen what seemed swelling or pouches under his eyes, and she remembered that one morning when she came into the hall he lay half-dressed on the bed with his naked legs over the bed-foot, and her mother was crouched in front of him, chafing his ankle joints. "Should you sorrow for every man that old age strikes down, my child, much will be your mourning," he said evenly and quietly. "You have great sons yourself now, Kristin. Sure it cannot come on you unlooked for that you see your father will soon be an old man. When we parted in old days, while I was yet young, we could not know any more then than we know now whether it would be the last time we would see each other on earth. I may yet live long, "'Twill be as God wills, Kristin."
"Are you sick, father?"
she asked tonelessly. "Some ailments come with the years," answered her father lightly.
"You are not old, father. You are but 52 years.
"My father never got so old. Come and sit here by me." There was a low grass-grown shelf under a rocky wall that leaned over the beck. Lavrans unclasped his cloak, folded it together, and sitting on it, drew her down beside him. In front of them the beck clucked and rippled over the little stones in its bed, swaying a branch of willow that lay in the water. The father sat with his eyes fixed on the blue and white mountains, far off behind the warm-hued autumn uplands.
"You are cold, father," said Kristin. "Take my cloak."
She unfastened it, and he drew the skirt of it around his shoulders, so that they both sat in its shelter. Under it he put one arm about her waist. "You know it well, my Kristin. He is unwise that mourns a man's going hence. Let Christ have thee, rather than I. Perhaps you have heard the saying. I trust firmly in God's mercy. And 'tis not so long the time for which friends are parted. Maybe will seem so to you sometimes while yet you are young, but you have your children and your husband. When you come to my years you'll think 'tis no time since you saw us who are gone away. And you will wonder when you reckon up the winters that have passed that they are so many. To me it seems now it's not very long since I myself was a boy, and yet it is many years since you were the little light-haired maid that ran about after me wherever I went. You followed your father so lovingly. God reward you, Kristin, for the joy I have had of you."
"Aye, if he reward me as I rewarded you."
She sank on her knees before him, caught his wrists, and kissed the palms of his hands as he hid her weeping face in them.
"Oh, father, my dear father, no sooner was I a grown woman than I paid you for your love with the bitterest sorrow."
"No, child, weep not so." He drew his hands loose and lifted her up beside him, and they sat as before. "Much joy have I had of you in these years too, Kristin. Fair and hopeful children have I seen growing up by your knee. A notable and understanding woman are you grown. And I have seen that more and more you have used yourself to seek help where it may best be had when you were in any trouble. Kristin, my most precious gold, weep not so sorely. You may hurt him you bear under your belt," he whispered. "Oh, don't sorrow so." But he could not check her weeping. Then he lifted his daughter up onto his lap and sat her on his knee. Now he had her even as when she was a little one, her arms around his neck and her face pressed to his shoulder. "There is a thing I have never told to any mother's child but to my priest. Now I will tell it to you. In the days when I was growing up at home at Skog, and when I was first with the bodyguard, I had a mind to take the vows as soon as I was old enough. No, I made no promise, not even in my own heart. There was much that drew me the other way, too. But when I lay out fishing in the Boden Fjord and heard the bells ring from the cloister on Hovedo, it seemed that drew me most of all. Then, when I was 16 years old, Father had made for me that coat of mail of mine, of Spanish steel plates soldered with silver. Rickard the Englishman at Oslo welded it together, and I got my sword too, the one I use always, and my horse armour. 'Twas not so peaceful in the land then as in your young years. There was a war with the Danes, and I knew I was like soon to have the chance to use my fair weapons, and I could not put them down. I comforted myself with the thought that my father wouldn't like it if his eldest son turned monk, and that I should not cross my parents. But I myself made that choice of the world, and I have striven to think, when the world went against me, unmanful would it be to murmur at the lot I had chosen. For I have seen it more and more with every year I have lived. There is no worthier work for a human soul that has found grace to conceive somewhat of God's loving kindness than to serve him and watch and pray for those men whose sight is still darkened by the shadow of the things of this world. Yet, I must say, my Kristin, hard would it be for me to give up for God's sake the life I have lived on my farms and lands, with cares for earthly things and with worldly cheer, with your mother by my side and with you, my children. Therefore must a man suffer in patience, when he has begotten offspring of his body, that it scorch his heart if he lose them, or the world go badly with them. God, who gave them souls, owned them, and not I. Kristin's body was still shaken with weeping, and her father began rocking her in his arms like a little child. Many things there are that I did not understand when I was young. Father held Asmund dear too, but not so as he loved me. 'Twas for my mother's sake, you see. Her he never forgot, though he took Inga because 'twas his father's will. Now would I wish that I could have met my stepmother again in this earthly home, and prayed her to forgive that I set no store by her kindness.
But you have said often, father, that your stepmother did you neither good nor evil, said Kristin through her weeping.
Yes, God help me. 'Twas my lack of understanding. Now, it seems a great thing to me that she didn't hate me and never gave me an angry word. How would you like it, Kristin, if you saw a stepson put before your own son at all times and in all things? Kristin was grown somewhat quieter. She lay now with her face turned outwards, looking towards the mountain range. A great grey-blue pile of cloud was passing over the sun, darkening the air. Some yellow beams stabbed through it, and a sharp glitter was thrown up from the water of the beck. Then her tears broke out anew.
"Oh no, father, my father! Should I never more see you in life?"
God guard you, Kristin, my child, so that we may find each other again on yonder day, all we who were friends in life, and every human soul. Christ and Mary Virgin and St. Olaf and St. Thomas will keep you all your days. He took her face between his hands and kissed her on the mouth. God be gracious to you. God give you light in this world's light, and in that great light hereafter. Some hours later, when Lavransdatter rode off from Jødkin, his daughter went with him some of the way, walking by his horse's side. Lavran's man had gotten a long way ahead, but he still kept on at a foot's pace. It was grievous to look on her despairing face all marred by weeping. So had she sat in the guest-house too, all the time while he ate and talked to the children, jested with them, and took them on his lap one by one. Lavran said softly, "Grieve no more for what you have to repent towards me, Kristin. But remember it, when your children grow big, and you think that they don't behave towards you or towards their father as you might think was right. And remember then too what I said to you of my youth. Faithful is your love to them, I know it well, but you are hardest where you love most. And I have marked that in these boys of yours there dwells self-will enough," he said with a little smile. At last Lavrans bade her turn and go back. "I would not have you go alone any farther from the houses." They were come into a hollow between little hills with birch trees round their foot and stone screes higher up their sides. Kristin pressed herself against her father's foot in its stirrup. She groped with her fingers over his clothes, and his hand and the saddle, and the horse's neck and quarters, rocked her head from side to side, and wept with such a deep lamentable sobbing that her father thought his heart must break to see her plunged in such great sorrow. He sprang from his horse and took his daughter in his arms, holding her in his embrace for the last time. Again and again he made the sign of the cross over her, and commended her to the keeping of God and the holy saints. At last he said that now she must let him go. So they parted. But when he was gone a little way, Kristin saw that her father slackened his horse's pace, and she knew that he was weeping as he rode away from her. She ran into the birchwood, hastened through it, and began climbing up over the golden lichen-covered stones of the scree on the nearest knoll. But the stones were big and hard to climb over, and the little hill was higher than she had thought. At last she was at the top, but by that time he was gone from sight among the low hills. She lay down in the moss and bearberry heath that grew on top of the knoll, and there lay long weeping, with her face hidden in her arms. Lavransdatter came home to Jorungard of an evening late. A cheering little warmth passed over him when he saw folks were still up in the hearth-room house. There was a faint flicker of firelight behind the tiny pane of glass in the penthouse wall. He had always felt that in this house was most of home. Ranfrid sat alone in the room with a great seam of work before her on the table. A tallow candle on a brass holder stood by her. She rose to her feet at once, bade him good evening, put more wood on the hearth fire, and went herself to fetch food and drink. No, she had sent the maids to bed long ago. They had had a hard day. But now, at any rate, they had barley bread ready baked to last till Yule. Paul and Gunstein had gone to the hills to gather moss. Speaking of moss, would Lavrans have his winter clothes made from the litmus-dyed web of cloth, or from the heather green? Orm of Moar had been there that morning asking to buy some leather rope. She had taken out the ropes that hung next the door in the shed and said he could have them as a gift. Yes, his daughter was getting on a little better now. The wound on her leg was healing up well. Lavran answered or nodded as he and his man ate and drank. But the master was soon done eating. He stood up, dried his knife on the back of his thigh, and took up a bobbin that lay by Ranfrid's place. The thread was wound on a pin that was carven into a bird at each end. One of these had had a piece of its tail broken off. Lavrans rounded off the break and carved a little on it, making the bird dock-tailed. At one time, long ago, he had made a great many such bobbin pins for his wife. "Must you mend these yourself?" he asked, looking at her work. It was a pair of his leather hose. Ranfrid was sewing patches on the inside of the thighs, where they had been worn by the saddle. "'Tis stiff work for your fingers, Ranfrid." "Oh." His wife laid the pieces of leather edge on edge, and bored holes in them with her awl. The servant bade them good night and went out. Man and wife were alone. He stood by the hearth warming himself, with one foot on the hearth rim and a hand on the pole of the smoke vent. Ranfrid looked across at him, and she grew aware that the little ring with the rubies, his mother's betrothal ring, was gone from his hand. He saw that she had marked it. "I gave it to Kristin," said he. "It has ever been meant for her. I thought 'twas as well she should have it now." At times thereafter one of them would say to the other, "Maybe 'twas time they went to bed." But he remained standing where he was, and she sat on at her work. They spoke some words about Kristin's journey. about work that was going on the farm, about Ramborg and Simon. Then they said somewhat again about its being, perhaps, time to go to rest. But again neither of them moved. Then Lavrans took the gold ring with the blue and white stone from off his right hand, and went across with it to his wife. Shyly and awkwardly he took her hand and slipped the ring onto it. He had to change it once or twice before he found the finger it fitted. It came to rest on the middle finger above her wedding ring. "I would have you take this now," he said low, without looking at her. Ranfrid sat still as a stone, her cheeks blood red. "Why do you do this?" she whispered at last. "Do you think I grudge our daughter her ring?" Lavrans shook his head and smiled a little. "Oh, I think you know why I do it." "You said before, this ring you would take with you to the grave," she said in the same whisper. "No one was to bear it after you were gone." "Therefore must you never take it off your hand, Ranfrid. Promise me that. I would not have any bear it after you." "Why do you do this?" she asked again, holding her breath. The man looked down into her face. "Last spring it was 34 years since we were wedded to each other. I was not yet a full-grown man, and all through my manhood you were at my side, both when sorrow came and when things went well with me. God help us! Too little did I understand how heavy was the burden you bore while we lived together. But I think now that it ever seemed good to me that you were there. I don't know whether you have always thought I held Kristin dearer than you. True it is that she was my greatest joy, and she brought me my worst sorrow. But you were mother to them all. It seems now to me that the worst of all will be to leave you when I go hence. Therefore you must never give my ring to anyone, not to either of our daughters even, but say they must leave it on your hand. Perhaps you think, my wife, you have had more sorrow with me than joy, and in a way things went wrong between us. But yet I think, through everything we have been faithful friends, and I have thought that hereafter we shall find each other again, in such wise that the wrong will not part us any more. But the love that was between us God will build up again better than before." The wife lifted her pale, furrowed face. Her great sunken eyes burned as she looked up at her husband. He held her hand still. She looked at it as it lay in his, lifted a little. The 3 rings gleamed, one above the other. Lowest down the betrothal ring, then the wedding ring, and above it this one. It came over her so strangely. She remembered when he had put the first on her hand, by the hearth in the hall of her Sundbu home, their fathers standing by them. He was white and red, round-cheeked, scarce out of his boyhood, a little bashful as he stepped forward from Sir Bjorgulf's side. The other he had set on her finger before the church door at Gerderud, in God's triune name, under the priest's hand. She felt it. With this last ring he had wedded her again. When, in a little while, she sat over his lifeless body, he willed she should know that with this ring he had espoused to her the strong and living force that had dwelt in that dust and ashes. She felt as though her heart was cloven in her breast, and bled, wildly as in youth. For sorrow, for the warm and living love she still secretly bemoaned that she had missed. For fearful joy in this pale shining love that drew her with it towards the uttermost bounds of the earthly life. Through the pitchy darkness that was coming, she saw the glimmer of another milder sun. She smelt the scent of the herbs in the garden at the world's end. Lavrans laid his wife's hand back in her lap and sat down on the bench a little way from her, with his back to the board and one arm upon it. He didn't look at her, but gazed into the hearth fire. When she spoke again, her voice was calm and quiet.
"I had not thought, my husband, that I had been so dear to you."
"Ah, but you were." He spoke as evenly as she. They sat silent a while. Ranfrid moved her sewing from her lap to the bench beside her. In a while she asked in a low voice,
"The thing I told you that night, have you forgotten it?"
"Such things a man can never forget. And so it is I have felt myself that things didn't grow any better between us after I had come to know it. Though God knows, Ranfrid, I strove hard that you might never mark I thought so much of it."
"I didn't know that you thought so much of it."
He turned sharply towards his wife and looked at her. Then Ranfrid said,
"'Twas my fault that things grew worse between us, Lavrans. I thought that since you could be to me in all ways as you were before, after that night, then you must have cared about me even less than I had believed. Had you grown to be a hard husband to me? Had you struck me, if only once, and when you were drunk, then I could have better borne my sorrow and my remorse. But that you took it so lightly."
"Did you think
that I took it lightly?"
The faint tremble in his voice made her wild with longing. She longed to plunge herself within him, to sound the unquiet depths from which his voice came forth strained and labouring. She flamed up.
"Aye, had you taken me in your arms one single time, not because I was your Christian wedded wife that they had laid at your side, but that I was the wife you had longed for and fought to win, then you could never have been to me as though those words had been unspoken."
Lavrans thought for a space.
"No, maybe I could not. No. Had you joyed in the betrothal that was given you, as Simon joyed in our Kristin?"
Lavrans made no answer. In a little he said softly, as though against his will and in fear,
"Why named you Simon?" "It could not come to my mind to liken you with the other,"
answered the wife, herself somewhat confused and fearful, but trying to smile.
"You and he are too unlike."
Lavrans rose to his feet and walked a few steps restlessly. Then he said, yet lower, "God will not forsake Simon."
"Did it never seem to you," asked his wife, "as though God had forsaken you?"
"No, never."
"What were your thoughts on that night we sat there in the barn, when you learned in 1 hour that we, whom you had held dearest and loved most faithfully, we had both been false to you as we could be?"
"I did not think much that time," said the man.
"And since," his wife went on, "when you did think upon it, as you say you did?"
Lavrans turned away from her. She saw a flush spread over his sunburnt neck. "I thought on all the time I had been false to Christ," he said very low. Ranfrid rose. She stood still a moment before she ventured to go to her husband and lay her hands on his shoulders. When he put his arms around her, she bowed her head against his breast. He felt that she was weeping. He drew her close into him and pressed his face down on her head. "Now, Ranfried, we will go to rest," he said in a little. Together they went over to the crucifix, bowed before it, and crossed themselves. Lavrans said over the evening prayers. He spoke low and clearly in the church's tongue, and his wife spoke the words after him. They took off their clothes. Ranfried lay down on the inner side of the bed. The pillows were made up now, much lower than of old, because her husband in these latter days had been often troubled with dizziness. Lavrans bolted and barred the room door, scraped ashes over the fire on the hearth, blew out the light, and lay down beside her. They lay in the darkness, their arms touching. In a little the fingers of their hands twined together. Sigrid Undset thought 'twas like a new bridal night, and a strange bridal night. Happiness and unhappiness flowed together and lifted her up on waves so mighty that she felt within her now the first loosening of the roots of her soul. Now had death's hand given her, too, a wrench. The first time.
"Speak to me, Lavrans,"
she prayed him softly.
I am so weary."
The man whispered, "Come to me, all ye who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Thus hath the Lord said." He passed an arm around her shoulders and drew her into his side. They lay a little, cheek against cheek. Then she said softly, "Now have I prayed, God's mother, to make for me this prayer, that I may not outlive you, my husband, many days." His lips and eyelashes touched her cheek in the darkness, as lightly as the touch of butterflies' wings. "My Ranfried, my Ranfried,"